All right, folks, welcome back to the Property Couch podcast. And we got an amazing episode for you today. We have got our chief tax advisor in the house. Her name is Julia Hartman, and we cover off debt recycling, joint tenants versus tenants in common, and a little sneaky land tax for Victorians that's coming up, Ben. But what else do we cover?
Well, also, Bryson, what's making property news? It's the dominating topic around the world is tariffs. And what's that going to mean for interest rates? So hang around to the end of the show where we talk about that.
What's it going to mean for interest rates, folks? You got to listen for that. Let's rip into the show.
Welcome to the Property Couch, where each week you get to listen to two of Australia's leading experts. Bryce Holdaway, co-host of Location Australia on Foxtel's Lifestyle Channel, co-host of Escape from the City on the ABC, and partner of Empower Wealth Advisory. Ben Kingsley, Chair of Property Investors Council of Australia and the founder of Empower Wealth Advisory, named the 2018 and 2019 Property Advisory Firm of the Year. Stay tuned as they bring you the insider's guide to property, finance and money management.
All right, folks, welcome back to the Property Couch podcast. And of course, welcome back to you too, mate. How are you?
Mate, I'm well, coming off the back of what was an epic weekend of footy, or wasn't really a weekend, started Thursday night, Friday night, finished on Sunday night. That gather round really does, I like it. I think it's good.
I've got a mate who goes, and he asked me to go, and I was away, but I'm certainly planning to do it because I think it'd just be a big carnival, right?
Yeah.
But, I think
I've added it to the bucket list.
Yeah. So for those of you listening that are in South Australia, hopefully you had a great time. But some good footy. But I noticed, mate, the correlation between, Collingwood had a win, so you obviously want to get up and about and talk about it. You normally want to move on pretty quick if it's not the Pies having a win.
Well, we've got a big game tonight against, the Lions. So, look, but also Freo had a win, so I thought you might be happy to talk about it, right?
Yeah, no, Freo did have a win, but they've got to win against some teams that are towards the top of the ladder for us to get all excited, Ben. So
all right.
The momentum's right.
Hey,
listen, we got an exciting conversation today to be had with the one and only Julia Hartman because we are in the shadows, Ben. A distant shadow, but it's definitely there. Of the 30th of June, which is obviously a key tax milestone in the country of Australia. So we are talking some conversations that we get around tax today, and it's kind of a little entree to what's coming up in the next few weeks, where we do a deep dive around what we need to do to prepare for tax time and how people can get the most out of it. But for some people with more complicated matters than most, Ben, the longer run-up they can have to be making some key decisions around that very important date of 30th of June, the better. But for those people who have got pretty straightforward tax affairs, lodged some investment properties, those sorts of things, it's business as usual at this time of the year.
Yeah, it is. I mean, I think probably the only thing just to quickly worth mention is the 20,000 instant asset write-off. That is in play. But it needs you need to actually have it implemented in your business before 30 June. So that's just one thing that just gives you a bit more of a runway in terms of that 20,000 instant asset write-off. But these are the ones that just percolate as a bit of a did you know, right?
Yep.
These are did you know tax stories that everyone should be having discussions about because that they're meaningful in a lot of respects, and a lot of people don't know where they can be caught out. In regards to some of these tax stories. So it really is, it's a great chat that we have with Julia, and so I'm looking forward to sharing.
Yeah, and we've had the office of Senator Andrew Bragg reach out to us too, Ben. So wanting to talk about the Coalition's housing policy. So we've been excited by that, and we've accepted that invitation. But he is the Shadow Assistant Minister for Home Ownership, and we've also in the interest of fairness, Ben, we've put a shout out to the Labor team as well to see if they want to have an opportunity. So it remains to be seen where they stand on accepting that invitation. But Ben, it'll be nice to hear from the coalface and also to put our questions to Senator Bragg to see how that sort of detail can help our community with the decision that's importantly coming up shortly.
Yeah, there was massive news over the last weekend around deductibility for first home buyers buying a new home from the Liberal Party. So that is a radical change of form So we want to talk to that story, but we want to basically, with so much changing, like we've had $425 billion worth of new spending in the last 3 years under the current government, and it doesn't look like it's going to slow down on both parties looking to buy votes. So yeah, we're going to ask some interesting question of the Liberal Party's overall policy for housing solutions. And then we'd love to get someone from a Labor spokesperson to come on and talk about them. Look, the two parties are really what matters. At the end of the day, they're the ones who form government. The other parties are a little bit irrelevant in terms of what they do. They just create a bit of noise, but at the end of the day, they don't get really much done. So the reality is they're the conversations that we want to have as part of that particular story. So yeah, looking forward to having that conversation and going deep on those policies. But it's no good doing it now because who knows what they're going to introduce next. We're seeing some tax handouts and everything. It's just, buy my vote. Don't worry about spending, is currently where we sit with both parties. So I want to ask some decent questions on both sides of the political divide.
Yeah, particularly on the supply side of the equation, Ben, because we don't need any extra stimulus on the demand side, which the weekend's activity has kindly given a little lift to, which, let's be honest, we probably, with the exception of the cohort that they're actually trying to help. So,
yes,
full respect
we
to
love
that.
the idea that they both want to help as many Australians get into property.
Yes.
We will start with that premises on both sides. Because
exactly. But then just to fuel the demand is
interesting in itself. Yep.
It is interesting. Hey, just a little shout out too that, Ben, for those people who are either interested or connected to someone who might be interested, we've got an ever-growing team that of people that we've been called to serve and help with our community. So we're looking for a buyer's agent. So if anyone wants to come and find out a little bit more about the opportunity that exists within our team to become a buyer's agent and to help the people that we love to serve, Ben,
yes,
we'd love to hear from you. So if you send a little note to info@empowerwealth.com.au, just leave your details, or you can leave your details on the Property Couch website as well, Ben. But yes, you might be someone who's interested in learning from the best and brightest in the country, or you may know someone who you could nudge and send our way. We'd love to hear from them as well. So
and if you're not in New South Wales or Victoria and you're in Queensland, that's ultimately we have buyers agents now in most parts of Australia. So we're definitely interested in helping grow the team to serve those clients who want us to help them find, negotiate, and buy a great property.
Well said. Hey, I'm not going to say anything more about the charity other than this, Ben, that last week I obviously gave a little nudge around that. We've got just over a month to go. So if anyone is feeling called to contribute to that, I'd clearly love for as many people to contribute as possible. Hey, before we get on to the show with Julia today, Ben, my Mindset Minute theme, it's a little reel that I found from the GOAT in my mind, the greatest of all time, Jim Rohn. Only second place would be Zig Ziglar, but I think Jim Rohn's voice and his concepts are outstanding. Let's have a little listen to this, and then we'll come to it at the end.
Somebody once said, if you took all the money in the world, divided it up equally among everybody, it would soon all be back in the same pockets. Incredible. Success is something you attract, not something you pursue. Success is looking for a good place to stay. So instead of going after it, you work on yourself. Personal development. See, the major question to ask on the job is not what are you getting. The major question to ask on the job is what are you becoming? See, the big question is not what am I getting paid here. The big question is what am I becoming here? Because true happiness is not contained in what you get. Happiness is contained in what you become.
Ben, what I really loved about that was the simple premise that success is something that you attract, not something that you pursue. And so it's largely about who you become on the way. And I think of the context of property investors, some people who have 2 or 3 investment properties, Ben, they needed to be a different person than someone before they had any investment properties at all. And so for anyone who doesn't have an investment property, and you know someone who's got 2 or 3 or 4 or 5, they had to go through the growth to allow them to be able to have that amount of responsibility in their life. So I just love the fact that it's something you attract, Ben, not something that you pursue. And it's largely around what our community's been doing for some time, is learning and seeding into their knowledge base. And to our hope, Ben, is to create some action around that. But just a little timely reminder from the GOAT of personal development.
He is the GOAT. He is the GOAT. There's no doubt about it. You can listen to him for hours, right? So much of it's so hard to consume, though, because it's such good gold. You just got to have it in bite-sized pieces.
Bite sizes. So, all right, folks, hopefully you can marinate on that as you go through the week. And given it's school holidays as we record this, Ben, I am interstate. So you and I had a conversation a couple of days ago with the one and only Julia Hartman. Let's cut to that interview now. All right, folks, today we are joined by Julia Hartman. She is the founder of the BAN TACS Group, which is a national cooperative, which is a body of professionals who specialise in tax and property. And she's also the Chief Technical Tax Advisor for Empower Wealth Tax. Welcome back to the Property Couch, Julia.
Thank you, Bryce. Great to be back.
It's always good to have you back, Ben. We had this idea that we might sort of ask Julia some questions, but how are we going to set up today, mate?
Yeah, so it's the way in which I sort of thought about it is there's some big topics that are running around. So I wanted to sort of focus in on 3 of those. And I feel like I've got my list of questions and we're walking in to see our tax advisor today, and that's Julia. And I want to go through those questions. So just to sort of summarize it, we're going to be talking about debt recycling. We're going to be talking about the land tax that's in Victoria. And we're also going to be talking about tenants in common versus joint tenants and some of the little nuances there. So that's how I thought we'd play it out. So let me see if I can scene set here and say debt recycling. A lot of people have different views about what debt recycling is. And only a couple of months ago, Bryce, we talked about it on the pod, but now we've got an expert in here. But I think it's really important to understand basically that a lot of people think debt recycling is some type of tax scheme or some types of tax promotion. And we want to be really clear about that. We don't ever want to be associated with any tax scheme where you're trying to get away from things. And Julia also brought this up in terms of when we do our regular catch-ups, there's also a lot of things that she's observing out there, and she writes blogs about those things. So I always say, go and check out Julia's blogs. But Julia, in terms of the common definition that you had for debt recycling, why don't we start there in terms of what most people talk about and what we think it is, and then we'll just branch off from that and have a bit of a discussion around debt recycling.
Well, it was interesting when we first talked, all 3 of us had a sort of different definition of what it is. And the basic idea of using your equity in your home to invest, don't have a problem with that as long as the loans are set up all right. But I'm very suspicious of some of the times I hear the word debt recycling used, and it implies that you can turn non-deductible debt into deductible debt. So that's what concerns me, and what people need to understand, that you can't do that through debt recycling. And I worry that it's dressed up as something like that. They don't actually say it, but you think that's what you're getting into, and you get into these products that are, if they say it, then the ATO's got them, dominant purpose of a tax benefit, or that they're getting you into products that you've got to buy or higher interest rates. It really worries me when I hear the word.
Julia, you've spent a lot of time sort of unpacking some of these rulings and the ideas and some of these concepts that come along. And it'd be fair to say that you are the person who is always bringing a calm approach to it, and you're also armed with Part 4A, which we'll talk about shortly. But I remember when Julia, when I first got into the gig, I was in my early 1998, so I was 23, and I remember it was buzzy. Like that, we used to get together and we thought we had this little underground sort of movement going on where let's see if we can outsmart the tax department. Let's see if we can turn some stones over that no one's ever turned before. But I think now, having been involved in it this is now my 3rd decade, it's fair to say that Part 4A is the ATO's weapon for any little underground groups that are trying to outsmart them, right?
Yeah, it's all about the dominant purpose. And if the dominant purpose is to get a tax benefit, in other words, increase your tax deduction, well, it's void from the tax office. Many years ago, there used to be a bit of an argument, but the dominant purpose is to pay your home loan off sooner, but that didn't fly. So, yeah, it's basically strict nexus. What was the money borrowed used to buy? And if you can't repay that loan because you've lost your job and you have to capitalise interest or something like that, or borrow elsewhere to pay it, then that's all right, because it's not the dominant purpose of the tax benefit. It's just to get the debt paid off. But when you get to a strategy that that's marketed, that's structured to increase the debt that's deductible, your dominant purpose is that tax deduction for the interest, isn't it? So
that's right, Julia. And I think for the community who don't know Julia's backstory, Julia has been around. She's been a leading tax specialist in Australia for decades in this space. She's written a couple of great books on this topic. And in one of those books, you were referencing when there was a ruling around when interest was deductible and obviously when interest on interest and those types of things. So why don't you tell us the little backstory in terms of what was originally a ruling and then what has changed? Because you gave us a little clue in what you were just talking about then.
Yeah, well, Harts case was the case, and it went through, I think there were 3 cases, and the ATO kept on losing. So in their true funded, unlimited taxpayer-funded fighting fund, they just kept on appealing until they won. But in the end, because at one stage one of the judges even said, well, what sane person wouldn't pay off their home and delay paying off their
investments?
Debt?
Yeah.
But in the end, it's like with the pride of a poker player with a full hand, they went to court the final time and said, all right, we admit it. Capitalised interest is tax deductible. Part 4A, there's a pamphlet for this loan that said do it for the tax benefit. So the dominant purpose is the tax benefit, so you've lost it. So yes, capitalised interest is deductible, but only when you can say that it's for a reason other than a tax benefit.
So here we are talking with our tax accountant. So this is fun for Bryce and I in terms of having these conversations. So, and this is why we want to go off on these little threads and have these little extra conversations. So based on the original dominant purpose, which is I wanted to pay my home loan off first, that was then squashed as well because, for a period there, that was, okay, my dominant purpose is I want to pay off my home loan before. And then eventually, to your point, the ATO kept pushing. When roughly was that, because I still hear people out in the street and spruikers and all of that talking about, the Harts case and you can claim interest on interest and you can do this debt recycling and those types of things. So roughly when was that? Because it is important to start getting that message out into the community that sometimes the tax laws change.
Well, we're talking about around the year 2000. Thanks for that question without notice, Ben.
Welcome to my world, Julia.
but I mean, you still hear it talked about, and so to your point, the interest on interest. If you're effectively trying to increase your deductible debt to pay off your home, in other words, the rent that's coming from your investment properties is fast tracking you paying down your principal place of residence, i.e., your non-deductible debt, and you're letting your debt increase, and then you're trying to claim the interest on that interest to accelerate that debt payment down, that's also been squashed as well, hasn't it?
That's right. That is a scheme. That is an arrangement with the dominant purpose of a tax benefit, isn't it?
Yeah.
What other reason?
Well, the dominant purpose is to pay off your home quicker, but the ATO doesn't.
I've tried that. I tried it to death, Bryce.
Come on, yo.
All right. Now, one of the things that we've been talking about was also this concept with debt recycling is that there is potentially a calculation that you're trying to perform. So let me see if I can explain this in an audio sense. So effectively, if I'm going to have a home loan and my home loan is on my principal home and I've got a P&I home loan and I've got a certain reduced interest rate on that home loan, and I've then got an investment loan, and an investment loan has an interest-only loan. So in other words, there's a premium of interest that I have to pay on that. That's where your question mark is around debt recycling, isn't it? In terms of, is there an overall benefit in terms of having loans structured that way? Do you want to talk to that story for us, Julia?
Yeah, the ATO seem to leave just interest-only loans alone, because that does fit in with, well, but same person. So you can pay P&I off your home loan and interest only off your investment loan. But would you if the interest rate is higher? Because if you get a 30-year loan with a slightly reduced interest rate, because it's P&I, you get to pay that loan off in 30 years. And that's, to me, saving a fortune in interest compared to, a percentage of that interest as a tax deduction. You've got to do the numbers. But I certainly did it with some figures for difference of between 7% for P&I and 8% for interest only, which I got off one of the bank's websites. And in 30 years, you've got the loan completely paid off for the same repayment rate. So it didn't P&I, because it was a lower interest rate, the repayments were no different. You got the loan paid off.
And that's a really important point. So if there's no other activity going on, in other words, if there's no other accumulation going on, or if you're not using offsets and all of these other things, the very raw numbers matter. And so that's the same sort of thing in terms of when we do our scenario modeling for our clients. What we're basically doing is, because remember, as an investor, if I'm in my accumulation phase, I am trying to reduce the amount of commitments that I have to release the amount of surplus that I need to potentially go and borrow more money to accumulate my next property. And so what do I need? What are the fundamental things that I need to borrow and to secure my next investment property? I need that surplus income. And then obviously I need to be able to have equity or cash to pay for that, to be able to secure that next property. So if all things were being equal and I had no other intentions of accumulating more, in other words, I've accumulated them, I then now need to fine tune the way in which I have my lending. And if the differentiation is too big between principal and interest only and owner occupied versus investor debt, that's ultimately what Julia is saying here, that why would you bother? Now, the reason why, if we're talking about debt recycling in the sense of a scheme, you don't do it. You absolutely don't do it. But if you're talking about what's your dominant purpose, if your dominant purpose is to create wealth and build, basically a retirement nest egg, then in theory, what you're also then saying is you're going, okay, to do that, I might have an amount of $100,000 in my offset or $50,000 in my offset, and I might need to be able to release that equity in my family home as a means to basically secure that property. And if I want to make that property deductible, so what I do is I pay down into the owner-occupied loan, and then ultimately I borrow those funds to invest in property. Is that acceptable in terms of the tax legislation, Julia?
Yeah, well, the dominant purpose there, it doesn't have anything in the SNP test, but the dominant purpose there is the banks aren't going to lend on the basis you've got money in an offset account because you can take it out at any time. Yes. So you're going to have to pay it down to free up on either the test of enough equity to borrow, or ability to repay, because once you pay it down, you can say, well, adjust my repayments so that I can afford another loan. Yeah.
So it seems like there's just a few ways that our audience can look at debt recycling, Ben. It's a word, right? Depending on, or a group of words, which depending on the intent for the use,
yes,
is the challenge. My very first exposure to debt recycling was an opportunity for a margin, an arbitrage. So if you paid off $20,000 off your home, you could redraw that $20,000 and invest it somewhere else. The interest becomes deductible, and the return that you get, the net, of actually doing that meant that there was a couple of extra shillings left overwards that you could put towards your home. So the whole reason for doing it is that little surplus that you pour onto the home, which can accelerate it. And then as you accelerate it, you do it again. And it just becomes a snowball running down the mountain in a legitimate, clean, unpolluted way of trying to pay off your mortgage without contravening the sniff test, without contravening Part 4A. So that's my first exposure. You just described it, Ben, how you could use the term debt recycling for what we do in our business. People have got equity in their home. Why don't we use the equity in their home to go and repurpose it for investment properties? But the challenge with that, with the first definition, is in the accumulation phase, there's actually a deficit. So we're not actually immediately achieving it, but through a couple of other parts of restructuring, we overall achieve it. So that's the second. Then the third one, which is the bit that makes Julia's blood boil, is in the definition where people are using it for marketing, for sizzle, for a whole bunch of reasons that are anything other than a legitimate way to increase your investing, pay off your home. But its primary purpose is just to try and fulfill the thing that I did very early in my career, Julia, which was to try and scheme ways to outsmart the tax office.
So these out there that you could, where would you go for properties that you could positive cash flow from?
Well, yes, you can do that, and it depends on how you want to do that, whether you go short term, whether you go further out from the city, which end of the risk scale that you want. So yes, very good point, Julia. I probably should have prefaced that by saying in our philosophies, we probably don't necessarily chase the positive cash flow properties, but yes, they definitely can be done. But it's really to the essence of why we're having this conversation today is definitely around the predominant purpose being to try and do something legitimate or to try and outsmart the ATO. And if you do that, I like the way you described it. They've got their ace up their sleeve. They drop Part 4A on the desk and the mic gets dropped.
So let's put a bow on the whole debt recycling conversation, because what Julia also mentioned about the capacity and the ability to actually accumulate another investment. And so when Julia said that the money is in the offset account, effectively the borrowing, the lender won't allow you to lend that money because you could take that money out. So ultimately, as you pay down that into the loan, what you're doing in terms of your loan application is that's a lower balance now. And that lower balance means that the lender will give you an approval for a higher borrowing amount. So, because you do need to be able to do that. But the bow that I wanted to put on it is too often we also see, Julia, people who have gone to auction without lining their ducks up in a row, and they've gone and bid at auction, and let's say they've bought a $850,000 property and they're now due for a 10% deposit on the fall of the hammer. And so they're like, oh, that's okay. I've got $85,000 in my offset account. So I'm just going to wire $85,000 across as the 10% deposit. What's the problem with that if I wanted to basically make that a loan that I ultimately want to be able to, claim against with my investment property?
The key word here is you can't owe money to yourself. So when you get it all sorted and you say to the bank, right, I want to borrow the whole $850,000 and, I'll give you some equity in my own home so that it stacks up. And they give you that and you go, well, 85,000 of that goes back into my offset account because that's where it came from. There's no nexus. So now 10% of that borrowing, the interest on that borrowing is not tax deductible because all it did was go into your own savings account. It's not borrowed to produce income. Once you paid something down off the original purchase price, it's gone. There is a way around this if you're onto it before settlement. So what you say at settlement, I want my deposit back and I want the bank to give the full purchase price as the borrowed funds. That's the only way you can untangle that. Otherwise, you lose 10%, whatever your deposit is. And if you're still trying to pay off non-deductible debt, that's sad, very sad.
Yes.
Don't let that lesson land. Don't let that lesson
Replay that one.
folks. That is super important, because how many people do you think would inadvertently do that, Ben? Like, because the way that we structure it up is we get the funds ready to go, so that then when someone's ready to purchase, they've got the dominant purpose for the funds, all ducks lined up in a row. But what Julia just described, I can imagine that's happening multiple times every Saturday of every week for people who are uninformed and ignorantly uninformed that, I'm just temporarily lending myself the money until I get it at settlement.
So lucky you get a second chance, because, in a lot of respects, if you don't sequence things correctly from a tax point of view, there's no luxury, there's no second chance from the ATO. But what Julia said, the second chance is that you obviously then get all of the funds to go back in on the completion, and you get the real estate agent to pay you back that deposit. So you can show the clear nexus of money coming back into the account and then where those final borrowings gone. Now, that's going to be a pain in the bum for the real estate agent. They're not going to be too happy about that, right? But that's the reality of not doing it the right way the first time in terms of setting up your ducks all in a row. Right, Julia?
All right, good one. There you go, folks. Hopefully that's helped with debt recycling. The next question here is around joint tenants do not technically inherit. Isn't joint tenants got the rule of survivorship? Let's unpack that a little further, Julia. Why do you say joint tenants do not technically inherit?
They don't receive the share of the property, let's say just husband and wife, half share of the property. They don't receive it through the will. There's nothing triggered as an inheritance to get it into the section on inheritance. In fact, in that area is another complete separate section for joint tenants, and it clearly states that if you're a joint tenant and you receive half a property as a survivor of that joint tenancy, then you are deemed to have owned that property basically the same as the joint tenant did. You go back to their cost base. And that's fine if it's a family home, never been used to produce income or something. But if it's exposed to income producing, you basically get the person's CGT liability as well. And if it's the home that they're living in when they die, then if it went through the will and you inherited, the other section of the Act says that if it's the deceased home, you reset the cost base to market value at date of death. So basically, if there's any capital gains tax liability on a property owned by two people and one dies living in the home and it goes through the will, you can halve the tax bill when the survivor eventually sells it compared to if you kept it as a joint tenant. Now, that's a huge tax saving, but it's like a tax trap. And so many times you see that normal family arrangements are eroded by little traps in the Tax Act.
All right, so can we? We need to go back up to 30,000 feet, which is all good.
Yep.
Okay, joint tenants in common. So basically, a joint tenant means that you have ownership with your spousal. Usually, that's the standard model. And if I was to get hit by a bus, Jane would then just basically, as a surviving interest, will take surviving ownership in that particular asset. Whereas tenants in common is effectively the surviving interest, or the interest of that property goes to the estate. And so that's what Julia is basically saying, is that if it goes to the estate, it resets the value, the capital value at that moment in time. So maybe we use an example here, Julia, off the top of my head. Let's say it's a holiday home, okay? And let's say that holiday home has it's been held in the family for 30 years, but there was a little period of time there where they, let it out for short stays or that type of thing, but that was a long time ago. How does that sort of impact, and what would be the situation here? Because I know that there's a couple of rules that you're going to explain in terms of you can only have one principal resident. So there's a few things in there in terms of how that looks. So that's helpful. Hopefully that will help unpack the scenario.
Oh, it's sort of talking about my favourite trick, which is sell your principal place of residence just before you die, get your main residence exemption on that completely, move into the holiday home and die there, and then your heir inherits it at market value like another one of your gold.
There's only one trick. You just got to be able to get the timing right on a part of something that you do not generally know about.
I had a client that did it triple.
Really?
Yeah, triple.
Wow.
It's a webinar on my website that tells the story.
If you think about Part 4A on the previous question, where the tax office is going, hang on a second, they're sniffing like crazy for all these little rabbit warrants. You'd think they would close that one, wouldn't you? That if just by two people, by having tenants in common versus joint tenants, everything else being the same, you can halve a tax bill, which in the case of property transactions can be significant amounts of money. You'd think that they close that one.
No, I think it should be the other way round. Why should a couple, like if you and Ben owned a property together, and Ben was living in it, right?
Yeah.
You own it as tenants in common. Ben dies, you get a reset to market value.
Yeah.
Why should the classic husband and wife arrangement of joint tenancy increase your likelihood of having a tax bill? I object to it the other way round.
Amen. I hear you. And if you can get that over the line, you'll have rounds of applause. But I'm thinking from the perspective of the ATO, they'd be going, hang on a second, that's a loophole we should close.
Well, what, that they reset to market value, or that they can have two properties or the three properties?
They can reset to market value instead of.
They've got to say Part 4A, you died just as a tax scam, haven't they?
This is what I love about. This is what I love about these three-way little chats that we have. You know, when we go in to see our accountant, who's Julia. Like I'm with you, Bryce. I agree that they'd be sort of, the government's looking for ways to always find more money. Right. So to your point, they're thinking if a lot of people do this, then we're gonna try and capitalise in terms of collecting more, death taxes, you might want to call them, in as part of that. But we all agree unanimously that it's unfair for spousal relationships to have this situation where they carry forward the capital gain loss of their beloved one. You know, whereas if we were set as tenants in common, it would go to my estate. Now, everyone's thinking, well, this is easily solved, isn't it, Julia? Let's all just quickly contact our lawyers and let's transfer our ownership from joint tenants to tenants in common. Now, let's not give away the trade-off here.
That's fine.
Yeah, the pun, right? But in terms of doing that, my question to you are these. Surely I've got to pay stamp duty.
No, because you haven't. Should not be. I mean, who knows what goes on in Victoria? But,
come on.
Okay, but traditionally, no stamp duty.
Haven't changed the ratio of ownership. You still own it 50-50.
Yep. So technically, no stamp. Any other little costs or tricks or anything else that I could get caught up on in terms of changing it on that without sort of the big reveal?
Well, I'm a bit worried about what this big reveal is, but there's no capital gains tax trigger either.
Yeah, there we go. So no So changing from joint tenants to tenants in common, hopefully no stamp duty. Check with your local legislators because again, the state governments want to get as much out of it.
Disclaimer.
Then then it doesn't trigger a capital gain because there's been no sale. It's just basic. So there's always potentially a catch. And what is the catch associated with this is it goes to the estate. And that means that, okay, what does that mean, Julia?
Well, it means it could be up to challenge because survivorship is always deemed as a way of making sure that it bypasses the will, no one can challenge it. But in New South Wales, someone did challenge the survivor and succeeded and got half the house.
Wow. Now, that's obviously with the joint tenants one. So there is a precedent set there. But we also know in terms of, so that means that if I'm in a loving marriage, it might be my second or third marriage or whatever, that would go to my will and last testament. But you could see a lot of people coming out of the...
Watch the queue. Where's the
and challenge the right to that ownership, or want to get some skin in that, some personal benefit out of doing that. So that's the trade-off, isn't it? The trade-off is it goes to the estate, and potentially there are people who can challenge the estate of that person and try and get some financial gain out of that structure.
Yes, but there is limited people who can challenge your will, and that is people that are living with you, dependent on you, your spouse and your children. So for the average, we're talking here to your young couples, unexpected death, that sort of stuff. The kids are probably minors. It's probably the first marriage, none of those messy businesses. Then I think it's a go. If the house has been exposed to capital gains tax, if it hasn't, there's no point.
Good. But if people were pulling over, they were stopping
property and living there.
Yeah, people were pulling over. They were stopping their gym sets as they were listening to this podcast or their jog, because they're starting to blow their mind in terms of, wait a minute. Remember, if it's your principal place of residence and you haven't had any other capital gain event or so, and it's always been that, nothing really to see here in terms of what that looks like, right? Well, but to the point of, if you wanted to look and explore this idea of changing from joint tenants to tenants in common, we would obviously say, please go and speak to your tax and legal advisors around the consequences and probabilities here for you. But that's what we're sort of saying. There are going to be situations where there may be a capital gain, and a significant one. And so what is our message here on point number 2, or topic number 2 here today? Tax planning and understanding the rules of the game are absolutely essential. And your investment savvy tax advisor should have that in the back of their mind in terms of understanding what capital costs, what you've done with that asset, what you haven't done with that asset, and whether there's a future capital gain. And they should be having dialogue with you about what your future plans are, and then navigating this pathway that gets you the best outcome legally, not Part 4A, not intentional tax avoidance, but legally working within the tax structures to be able to get the best outcome for you.
Hey, Julia, I know you love questions without notice. I live here in Torquay. I've got a house around the corner that I used to live in. And then the house that I'm in now was meant to be a temporary house, but no one wants to move, right? So, and the reason it was a temporary house is because we were going to knock over the previous one and build a house on it. And that's still in the mix, right? So do I get to choose between which of the two was my principal place of residence if I was in the 6-year window, if I go back to that one and move into it? And because we're talking about polluting purpose here, it's got a tenant in it. It's had a tenant in it for the last 3 years.
It only has to be covered by your main residence exemption. You don't have to actually technically be living there. So I should have been more specific when I was talking before.
Yeah.
There's a little section in 118190 that says you can cover it with your main residence exemption under the 6-year rule, even though you're not living there. It could be in a nursing home or whatever.
Yeah.
Or it can be rented out.
Yep.
And still be considered your main residence at the date you died. So yes, that one that's around there that you used to live in, I can see where you're going with this, Bryce. I think you should turn that. If it's it's joint tenants at the moment, I think.
No, my wife owns it. She owns everything.
Oh, yes, that's the thing, isn't it? So
yeah.
No tricks there. But if you did own joint tenants, that's the ideal one to change to tenants in common. If you get hit by the bus, then she can work it out. She's got options. And especially if you've still got a young family, you're unlikely to have your will challenged by anyone that you wouldn't want to have access to it anyway.
Julia, speaking of will challenges, if I'm in a new relationship with stepchildren, stepchildren also can challenge a will. Is that my understanding?
Well, that case I was talking about in New South Wales, it was a stepchild that managed to kick his mother out of the home, make it sold, and and get the half of the house that was his stepfather's. So
hey, Julia, I've seen a scenario where a male went into a relationship with a female. She had a son an adult son. And because he was so savvy with real estate, he was a real estate agent. What he did is in the relationship, they bought a new house largely with her money. So he contributed very little, and buying that house, she was unwell, and he knew that she was unwell, and so guess what structure they bought it in? Joint tenants, so that when she passed away, he got the rule of survivorship, and the son ended up getting nothing. So if for people need to understand the difference between joint tenants and tenants in common. It matters. And for a lot of people, by default, they get caught up in the whole conveyancing process, and it's one of those details that if you're doing it with a shared partner with shared agendas, sometimes it can just be one of those things that just sort of happens. But knowing the difference between the two matters.
Just recently, only sort of 6 or 7 months ago, my parents have a large property up at Yarrawonga, and there's 2 residents on there, and they've effectively subdivided the middle and have joint ownership across. And I just said to Dad, do you know if it's joint tenants or tenants in common? And he just looked at me and he went, no. I said, I think we need to find that out for both parties' benefit. And of course, it did come back that it was tenants in common, equal share. Mm-hmm. So, that's sitting as it should appropriately be, because ultimately for the other owner of the other property, she wants her inheritance and assets to go to her son. And then in terms of my parents, it obviously will roll into my brother and myself. So it is obviously an important part of that particular story. So here's why it really is important to, when you're going to see your accountant, don't just have a tax conversation around just the current tax year. Start thinking and asking some questions around that, because these conversations lead into did you know moments, and it builds up your knowledge as part of that story, which does lead us into the third story, which, I normally don't like ending on a story that just gets me upset.
We're just going to feel Julia's Victorian.
She's not the only one who doesn't like the Victorian government at the moment. I mean, I think I'm first in that queue. Yeah. I think I've taken that position earlier. Anyway, what we want to talk about is Victoria's land tax grab, which is this trap that we have since learnt about. Now, we know that land tax in Victoria, the government changed it as part of this COVID debt recovery, but it's more than COVID debt recovery. They can't manage money; they're useless. And we need to kick them out. There you go. I just got that in as a sidetrack.
Don't want to get political, but here's my
don't want to get political, but they're shocking. They're putting us into record levels of debt. They're chronic. They can't do one job, which is
you double clicked. You double clicked.
All right. So in January of 2024, this ruling kicked in where the effectively the exemption, right? So the land tax kicked in at 300,000, right? And now that dropped to 50,000, and it was meant to, I think from memory they were quoting, it was only going to affect something like 65,000 people in Victoria. Well, guess what? It's actually affected a lot more people, Julia. And so I'm going to hand it over to you, Julia, for you to explain who has actually been caught up in this mess. And we are talking about people who live in their own home.
Bryce, if you think that was bad, you ought to have heard him squeal when I told him about this.
I said, what, another one?
I wish I hadn't.
Well, anyway, I knew it was going to be on the agenda when I said it. What's happened? The threshold that if you own any property other than your main residence, if it's unimproved land value, used to be more than 300,000, you were caught for land tax. They dropped that down to 50,000 now.
The threshold.
And most people think, well, it's still people that own 2 properties, so fair enough, we've got to recover the money from somewhere. But the trouble is, it's $50,000 worth of land used to produce income or in a business.
Uh-oh.
So if it's your main residence, you might be exempt for part of it, but if the area that you're using for your business or for an Airbnb, or even if you've got a granny flat on it and that's a separate residence you're renting out, if it's any of that used in a significant business, which I'll define in a minute, then you've got to look at how much of the land area that's taking up and say, well, if that's more than 10% and the land's worth 500,000, bingo, you're up for land tax because
cheeky bath plugs. Cheeky
$1,000 is being used in a business. Well restrained there, Ben. So significant business, you might think, oh yeah, but who'd have a significant business in their home? Well, if you earn more than $30,000 in that business, you're caught.
You're cooked.
Yeah, you are. And we're not talking about, I'm going to say, well, how many is that? Maybe 500,000 households? According to an article from Patrick Durkin in the Fin Review on the 18th of March, he's quoted as saying, more than 400,000 Victorians who run a small business or an Airbnb from their family home will be hit with hefty land tax bills for the first time as the state government's change designed to try to retain and kick the debt problem that they've got. So this is unbelievable. Now, what they're doing is they're data matching. So everyone's sort of saying, well, how would they know? Well, you know,
we're in an AI world.
Yeah, they're obviously data matching with the ATO. And what's your job when you're putting in your tax return is you want to basically try and get the maximum tax you can. So you're declaring that you're, you know, as much as the house as possible, please. Just declare as much as all of the costs as possible because I want to offset them. So it's a complete, like they've walked into a absolute time bomb.
That's a tripwire.
That's a tripwire. It's a tripwire. That's the way to call it. It's a tripwire.
Cheeky
So you've got to self-assess and dob yourself in too. Yeah. And if you don't, there could be fines of up to 90%.
And they've already dobbed themselves in because they've been so they've gone back to a last couple of. That's how they're issuing all of these land tax bills. I mean, who would work in the State Revenue Office here in Victoria? I mean, what a horrible job! What a horrible job! Taking money off your fellow Victorians.
Shout out to our listeners from the State Revenue Office.
Yeah, we understand it's a tough job and you're just doing your job. It's not, yeah, but you know, I don't want to be. But so there you go. I mean, now the car's crashed and the people have dropped the weights on themselves in the gym and sort of saying, seriously, like, was that the intention in terms of? Again, small family-owned businesses, the heart and soul of our country, these small business operators getting slugged again with another $975, and in some cases it's going to be even higher depending on the price of your unimproved land. And you're just trying to run a business.
We already got the Bank of Melbourne. We don't need the Bank of Victoria. They're still using property investors as ATMs for the state, Julia. And here's just another example of them just being greedy.
I give the viewers some useful stuff now.
Yeah, well,
you mean rather than our rant?
Sure. If Ben and I say nothing, then it switches into useful. Here we go.
The reason you should pick your ears up and be concerned about that, if your business turnover is more than $30,000, or, now I say or, not and, it's any of these things can trigger it, you employ staff in that business that are not family members, or you're using more than 30% of your home exclusively for business use, that it's not intermingled with other private use. And for the granny flats that, you know, you might be renting out separately from your home. It's not like if you've got a self-contained area in your home, but a granny flat that would be considered a separate residence, if you're earning rent on that, yeah.
Wow. So if you're earning less than 30,000, but you're using more than 30% of your house, do you get caught?
Still caught, yeah.
Oof.
Well, it's a bit subjective and all that sort of stuff, but yeah, that's the basic parameters I'd like to give people. And what you've got to do is apply for an exemption anyway, if you want to try and get around it that way. So you'd go for a rule, you know, you'd apply to them and say, well, I'm not, but they're in the examples they give in this ruling. This ruling has been around for years, but back when it was $300,000, it didn't bother people because if it was 10%, that's a $3 million piece of land. It didn't affect many people. But now it's 10%, it's a $500,000 piece of land. So in that ruling, those are the sorts of examples they give of when they consider it to be a significant business. You'd have to apply to see if you can argue different. And we might get a few more examples because I imagine back in the $300,000 day, that was probably not very tested.
Well, hence they would have claimed as much of their property as possible. So now I can see all of these Victorian small business operators working from home, even the hairdressers and all that, saying the storage room no longer.
Yes.
How can I get under
Yes.
that? And I'm not going to employ anyone anymore. I'm just going to do it all myself.
Yeah, and I earn 29,800. Yeah.
Correct. And if I used to run my business out of my study, but also use the kitchen as a board, that's no longer. Meeting rooms aren't going to. So I'm just in that little study now, and they're going to sort of start.
Everyone's going to straighten back up.
Got to squeeze it all back down.
And the idea is to not get it exclusively for private use. So you'd say, well, the kids come in and do their homework there. That's another example in that ruling that has the kids come in and use the area to do their homework. So it's not.
Of course they do. Of course they do.
Like the way you think, yeah.
Yeah, they're coming in to do their homework, and the wife is also doing the bookkeeping for the house, which is not a business.
Yeah.
She's basically managing the family budget.
Yeah.
She does that a bit more often now as well.
Very good.
But Julia, obviously running the small business out of your family home has capital gains risks as well.
Mm.
So I think, again, it's an important thing to consider in terms of where you are operating your business. And because, like, the reality is we run from home because we don't have to pay 30, 60, 80, 90,000, whatever it is to lease an office. So it is about sort of then starting to work out, where those lines are met in terms of the capital gain.
So if capital gain is triggered, what you've got to do is say, and it's not a matter of you don't claim the expenses, so you don't have to pay capital gains tax. It's a question of fact. Are you seeing clients there? You've got a sign out the front. Is it exclusive use area? Is it a place of business as such? And that's well defined. But if it's a large enough area that you're using as the place of business, you may well be able to get the small business concessions. So instead of using the main residence exemption, the small business concessions, assuming you pass the small business test, could mean you pay no capital gains tax on it anyway. But
what's the threshold on the small business concession, Julia, just if you know it off the top of your head?
Well, there used to be a thing up on the ATO website that implied about, just using 10% of the home in your business. It was used in the business, small business concessions. But there's a recent case where the ATO successfully argued, no, it wasn't. The majority of the home was private use, so the small business didn't apply to it. So we're in a bit of a flux there, but certainly if you say 50% of the area is used in your small business, you're pretty safe. The rest of the way, you'd have to go for your own private ruling at the moment, because I don't think either side of the tax office even know which way that would go. So it's got to be, but you wouldn't not have a go at getting the small business concessions if you're caught. Alternatively, you might say, well, no, I've got another office somewhere where I see clients and I don't have a sign out the front. So I'm not actually, it's not a place of business. So I can't claim interest, I can't claim rates, I can't claim insurance or anything like that. But I can claim 67 cents an hour for working there. But you have to keep a diary to show every hour that you work there.
Yeah, well, there you go. All right. Well, we've covered a bit of ground today, Ben. We've covered debt recycling. We've talked about joint tenants and how you can potentially halve a capital gains tax bill. And, of course, we've talked about the Victorian government using us as the ATMs for the state. So once again, you've delivered, Julia. You've found the little intricacies, the little known
something fresh.
Yes. So as always, we appreciate you doing that, and thank you very much for joining us on the podcast.
Thank you, Bryce and Ben. It's been fun.
Thanks, Julia.
Oh, there you go, Ben. Well, what I do love about Julia is we've had a number of conversations with her over the journey, and she's such a detail-oriented, and she loves making sure she gets it right.
Yes.
And so, but what it's evolved with over time, and I think that conversation has allowed us to see a side of Julia where we just riff it, and we have that sort of the whole idea that you keep saying before we push record with Julia is we're trying to create this fireside chat type of environment. I think we achieved that. And I think there was some really good content there from Julia.
Yeah, I mean, this is why I wanted to bring these topics to the table, right? Who knew that your principal place of residence in Victoria could, if you're working from home, could potentially be hit with the land tax bill. I mean, that's the sort of stuff that, you're walking into a door moment. You don't want to walk into the door and get surprised by that. So, no, she's technically brilliant. I love having long discussions and debates with her also because obviously, there's the technical, but there's also the politics that play into those types of stories as well. And we're trying to get the balance right. It's never easy, but certainly there's plenty to be discussed. And so hopefully that's a good takeaway for everyone. And now you can go down, at the pub, or you can go and talk to your friends at the next dinner party and say, "Did you know?" Right? And you've got some extra info up your sleeve.
Bit of nostalgia there, mate. Did you know that it's a blast from the past from you? And thank God we don't have the international sign-offs anymore. Some would argue they want to bring that back. But so thank you, Julia. Debt recycling, joint tenants versus tenants in common, and some of the details around that. And of course, what Ben just said there around having another discussion to have down at the pub for land tax in Victoria. Hey, my life by design hack today, Ben, is I came across this. As you know, I'm a battling parent, Ben, trying to plant as many seeds as I can in my boys' life, and this one particularly resonated, and I thought it might work for both of us and for anyone else who wants to equally plant the seeds in their children. But it was this: instead of asking your child what they want to be when they grow up, ask them these questions instead. Number one, what kind of problems do you want to solve when you grow up? Number two, what's one thing you could do every day without getting bored? Number three, what do you love doing so much you forget about time? Number four, what kind of impact do you want to have? And number five, what makes you feel excited to wake up in the morning? I thought, isn't that clever? Just to reframe the conversation around what do you want to do when you grow up, because it's changed, right? We've gone from the feudal system to the industrial system. We're now pivoting into the digital age. So it's important that we don't necessarily, what worked for us in the 70s, Ben, is going to be different for our kids. So how do they want to contribute? How do they want to make a difference? And what impact do they want to have are questions that I want them to be starting to have. So I floated these questions past the boys the other day. And to give you a bit of lived experience, Ben, there was a few blank looks. I
was about to say, and we would have been probably the same, that we couldn't see past a week or 2 weeks, let alone think about what we wanted to be in the future.
And so then after some reflection, they said, one said they're going to just earn a living in the NBA, and the other one says they'll earn a living in the AFL. So I'm just thinking, all right, well, I don't want to discourage their dreams, but I also want them to have a number of options on the table. So
I've got one of those NBA players, as well.
But so there you go, folks. There's a few different questions to ask. So it's not one and done. Clearly, I'm gonna circle back and see if they've marinated on it and if they've come up with something. But what kind of problems are you going to solve when you grow up? What's one thing you could do every day without getting bored? What do you love doing so much you could forget about time? I said playing Fortnite doesn't qualify. Number four, what kind of impact do you want to have? And number five, what makes you feel excited to wake up in the morning? So, folks, there you go. There's a couple of alternative questions, 5 in total, instead of asking them what they want to be when they grow up. Check it out. Let me know how you go. Ben, what's making property news?
Well, we promised this, Bryce, about talking about interest rates and what's happening off the back of the US tariff, discussions. Well, they weren't really discussions, were they? They were sort of, this is what we're going to do. The Trump administration and Donald sort of led his conversation there. It didn't quite go, well, who knows? Maybe it's all part of the art of the deal. In terms of, getting leverage, as they now say. There's always some way in which you can spin the conversation. But the bottom line is that tariffs aren't good for economic growth more generally. So there is going to be an economic shock that is occurring around the global economy, and that has consequences both direct and indirect in terms of what's happening here in the Australian economy. And so what that has meant, now you've got to remember also when we were seeing those very significant tariffs. Then we saw a 90-day pause and everyone just getting hit with a 10% tariff instead of the reciprocal tariffs that they were also talking about. But we've definitely seen a movement in terms of what's going to happen with interest rates. So we're now saying the big major banks, ANZ, Westpac, CBA and NAB, have definitely pulled their first rate cut into May. with a very strong probability of a 25% cut and a small, depending on what happens between now and then, because it's a bit of a changing feast every day, potential of a 50% base cut off the cash rate. Now, of course, they're also sort of saying that they believe that the cash rate will move into the low threes over the course of the next 12 or so months. And I think that's a reasonable consensus in terms of depending on what basically happens. Now, we saw Governor Lowe. She spoke Thursday week ago. It was the first time since these tariffs were announced. And she's sort of saying, look, we are well placed in terms of to be able to deal with that. In other words, we've got the ability to move if we need to. But she's also remaining reasonably cautious about the level of movement. In other words, she's saying we don't have to move like we did through the GFC. We potentially don't have to move. They don't think the impact will be as bad as a global financial crisis or as bad as a pandemic. So I think what we want to be careful of is thinking that we're going to get back down to those emergency level interest rates. That's not what's at play here. But certainly there's going to be some movement in the cash rate. That is going to mean that there's going to be improved savings inside the household. And so that is, that's got to be delicately managed, because if people's house prices are going up, they've got a little bit more disposable income. Then what does that mean for business in terms of baking in higher prices? So there is a delicate piece of work that needs to be done here by the RBA and the board. So, but the bottom line is, historically speaking, as we see interest rates go down, we do see more activity in the housing market, and obviously with supply constraints and the cost to construct a home, we're seeing some more of that pressure on existing housing, and so we do believe that this will add to the uplift in terms of house prices over the remainder of this year.
Yeah, well said. So it will be interesting to see how that plays. He is playing a very, very big game of bluff, and it's going to be interesting to see how that plays out, right? So maybe that's maybe it's short-lived, maybe not. But stay tuned. We'll obviously keep updating throughout the podcast as we do over the journey, Ben. But look, I think it's been another really great episode. Again, thanks to Julia for her continued and wonderful contribution, and hopefully our community, Ben, is getting enormous value from the little insights. And I can promise you, folks, that Julia sees something and she hunts it down. So if something becomes topic of interest, she will then go and write blogs about it. She'll go and hunt it down. She'll go and get the level of detail, and we will become the beneficiaries of that. So Julia, we certainly appreciate you.
And that's why she's our chief tax analyst and advisor for our group, because it's just so important to get that right. At the end of the day, we're trying to maximize the returns for our clients, and she is that chief technical officer.
She's doing the chief technical officer, and also Ben, we are trying to optimize and be efficient on tax, but we're also, as we see from even the debt recycling conversation we had earlier today, we're also trying to help people avoid sort of janky tax minimisation schemes, right?
Correct.
So to stay on the right side of Part 4A is essentially the other mission that we're trying to serve here as well. So thank you, Julia. We certainly appreciate that, mate. Thank you to you always for your wonderful contribution. And hopefully, I don't know who Brisbane's playing this week, mate, but hopefully Brisbane get a win. But until next week.
Knowledge is empowering, but only if you act on it.
See you next week, folks.